The morning I said it, the kitchen window was white with frost, and the kettle had just started its thin, complaining whistle on the back of the stove. My youngest was still asleep in the basket by the bench, making those small, damp breaths babies make when they are too warm under too many blankets. I remember my hands more than anything else. One was wrapped around a chipped blue mug. The other was pressed flat against the table as if I needed to steady not my body, but the wood itself. I was 24 years old. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn, and I could hear one hoof strike once against the boards. Inside, the clock above the pantry ticked so loudly it felt personal. Jonas stood by the sink with his back to me, buttoning his work shirt, and I said the smallest sentence I have ever been afraid to say. I said, very quietly, "I do not think I can do this again." He did not turn around. He did not ask me what I meant. He did not raise his voice. He only stood still, one hand at his cuff, as if the whole room had paused to hear whether I would take the words back. I did not. That was the first time I understood what happens in some Amish homes when a woman admits her body has limits. My name is Hannah, and this is the Amish Stories, the channel where I tell the truths that lived behind the prayer cap and were almost never spoken out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I married at 19 and I left at 26. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, like this video, and stay with me to the end. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, or whether you ever grew up somewhere that taught you your body belonged to duty before it belonged to you. I read every single one. In the outside world, a woman can say she is tired, or frightened, or not ready, and at least in theory those words belong to her. In my community, words like that did not disappear exactly. They just changed shape. They became evidence of something wrong in you. Weakness, selfishness, pride. That is the thing about the Ordnung. People outside Amish life sometimes imagine it as a book, a binder, a list kept in a drawer somewhere by the bishop. But the Ordnung is rarely written down. It lives in the air. It moves from mother to daughter, from father to son, from sermon to supper table, from what is spoken to what is withheld. It does not have an official name for every rule, but it exists the way many things in Amish life exist, everywhere, and without needing to introduce itself. Everyone knows. No one says. We were taught the structure of the world early, and so often it felt less like teaching than weather. God above all, then the bishop, then the husband, then the wife, then the children. That order was not debated. It was breathed. A wife submits, a husband leads. That verse fragment was repeated so many times it stopped sounding like language and started sounding like furniture. Something always there. Something load-bearing. Silence was load-bearing too. We had a word for yielding, Gelassenheit. It was spoken with reverence, almost tenderness. To yield was holy, to bend was beautiful. To make yourself soft enough for the will of God, soft enough for the needs of others, soft enough not to insist upon your own mind or appetite or fear. And for women there was another word, spoken with warning, Hochmut. Pride. Pride was not only vanity in the way English people sometimes mean it. Pride for us could also be a woman believing her own pain was important enough to name. That was the architecture, the silence, the yielding, the order in which everyone stood, and because it was architecture, you did not notice it until something in you leaned against it and found it would not move. I met Jonas at a singing in late October, when the fields were already stripped down and the evenings smelled like cold apples and damp wool. He was not handsome in a storybook way. He was quiet, broad-shouldered, with a way of listening that made older people trust him. He laughed rarely, but when he did, it surprised his whole face. Our families had known each other for years. His father and mine had helped one another bring in hay. His sisters quilted with my aunts. Nothing about us looked unusual. That was the point. We courted the way many Amish couples do, not with long declarations or rebellion, but with buggy rides and group singings, and the shy, heavily watched closeness our world allowed. He was steady. He worked hard. He spoke gently to horses and children. When he asked if I would marry him, it was in a tone so calm it sounded almost like asking whether I would pass the butter. I said yes, because that is what came next. We were married on a Thursday in November. There were nearly 300 people. I wore the stiff new dress, the white apron, the prayer covering pinned so tightly it gave me a headache by midday. The preaching lasted hours. The benches were hard. My feet went numb. The men talked in low voices outside while the women arranged platters of roast chicken, noodles, creamed celery, bread, beets, pickles, and pies enough to feed a county. 7 kinds, I think, maybe more. In memory, there are always more pies than people. Someone once asked me whether I was happy that day. I do not know how to answer that in a way people understand. I was obedient. I was admired. I was exhausted. I was 19 and stepping into what had been presented to me as the holiest form of womanhood available. Happy is a word from the outside world. Inside mine, the better word was suitable. Jonas was not cruel. I want to say that early and clearly. He was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside. He followed the script he had been handed because it had been handed to him in the voices of people he trusted, and because in our world, obedience was not considered a moral failure. It was considered virtue. Our first child came less than a year later, a boy with a solemn forehead and dark hair that stood straight up after his bath. Then a daughter. Then another boy I lost before anyone outside the family knew there had been one to lose. Then another daughter, born after a labor so long I remember the kerosene lamp burning low and high and low again, as if it too were trying to survive the night. After that came another baby and then another. My body became a calendar I no longer controlled. Pregnancy, nursing, bleeding, mending, lifting, kneading, carrying, waking, soothing, repeating. A body that had been working a long time. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not cure. Women in my community knew that tiredness the way they knew bread dough by touch. You could see it in the way they lowered themselves onto benches, in the pause before standing, in the hand pressed briefly against the small of the back when no one important was watching. But tiredness was not a category that protected you. It was simply the texture of your days. By 24, I was thinner than I should have been, and older in the eyes than my age deserved. I had started to dread the feeling of my own body, not because I hated it, but because it no longer seemed to belong to me in any useful sense. It belonged to work. It belonged to feeding children. It belonged to expectation. It belonged to the future someone else kept planning on my behalf. The inciting thing, if I can call it that, was so small an English listener might miss it entirely. One cold morning with 2 children at the table and one fussing on my hip, I said to my husband that I did not think I could carry another baby. I did not say never. I did not say I would refuse him. I did not speak in anger. I spoke the way one might speak about the weather turning or a field not yielding. Plainly, carefully, as if honesty itself could be made modest enough to pass through the room without offense. But some truths cannot be made small enough. Jonas said nothing that day. Not that day, not the next, not the day after that. I waited for him to be angry. I waited for him to argue. I waited for anything at all. Nothing. At first, if you are not from a controlling world, that may not sound like punishment. That is because you are imagining silence as absence. In my community, silence had shape. Silence could be arranged and wielded. Silence was architecture. He answered the children. He thanked me for supper without looking up. He asked for his clean shirts by speaking into the room as if the room itself might fetch them. At night, he lay beside me at the far edge of the mattress, not touching me, not speaking, and the distance between us felt wider than any field I had ever crossed. The warmth went out of the house without the stove ever cooling. That was Tier 1, though I would not have called it that then. Then I only knew that the temperature had changed. Tier 2 arrived in the form of my mother, the way Amish women always deliver warnings, with a pie and their hands already busy so their faces do not have to tell on them. She came on a Tuesday afternoon carrying shoe-fly pie and a basket of mending. The children were outside with the older boys from next door, turning the mud around the pump into a kingdom of sticks and tin cups. My mother sat near the window where the light was best and threaded her needle without looking at me. She asked how the baby was sleeping. She asked if Jonas had gotten the south fence repaired. She asked whether my hens were laying through the cold. Then, as if she were continuing a thought we had both always been having, she said, "A wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes." That was all. I remember staring at her fingers, at the speed with which they moved through the torn cuff in her lap, and realizing that she had not come to comfort me. She had come to warn me back into line. I said, "Ma'am, I am so tired." She nodded once, still not looking up. Most women are. There are sentences that split your life in two. Not because they are dramatic, but because they reveal the floor beneath you has been different from what you thought. Most women are. Meaning this was not unusual. Meaning I was not singular. Meaning there were names for my condition in the mouths of women, but not names that could save me. After my mother came my sister-in-law Miriam, with coffee cake and that careful brightness women wear when they have been sent to feel out another woman's soul. She talked about calves, about the wedding of a cousin in Geauga County, about a woman in another district who had grown difficult after the birth of her sixth. She said the word difficult softly, almost kindly, but I heard the iron in it. "You have such lovely children," she said at last. "Some women are not so richly blessed." I said nothing. She added cream to her coffee, though I had seen her drink it black for years. "We must be careful not to confuse burden with blessing." There it was again. Sideways, never direct, never plain enough to answer. A week later, the bishop's wife arrived unannounced. That is tier 4, though by then I had stopped counting and started bracing. She was a tall woman named Sadie with dry hands and a voice like folded linen. She admired the baby. She praised the neatness of my pantry. She asked if I had been praying over my unrest. My unrest. Such elegant words for a body begging not to be used past its strength. "I have been praying," I said. "And what answer have you been given?" It was not a question, not really. It was a gate. The correct answer was obvious. I looked at the floorboards between us. "I do not know." She smiled then, a small, sad smile that made me feel younger than I was. Sometimes not knowing is another name for resisting. When she left, she placed one hand on my shoulder, very light, and said, "Peace returns when order returns." I stood in the doorway after her buggy rolled away, the baby heavy against my chest, and thought, if peace requires my disappearance, what kind of peace is it? But I did not say it. Not yet. The first person who told me the truth was an older woman named Lydia. Of course it was Lydia. In every closed world, there is at least one woman who has learned too much and can no longer fully pretend otherwise. She will not rescue you. Rescue belongs to stories that like themselves too much. But she may place one live sentence in your hands and walk away, and sometimes that is enough to keep you from mistaking your cage for a home. It happened at a quilting frolic in February. The room was warm with bodies and steam and the smell of starch and coffee. Women moved around the frame and practiced rhythm, hands smoothing fabric, voices low, children underfoot like weather. Lydia was nearly 70, a widow with pale eyes and a back bent from work. People called her sharp, which in Amish country can mean truthful in a way others find inconvenient. She was snapping green beans into a bowl by the stove when I went to refill the coffee pot. We were alone for less than a minute. She did not look at me. She said, "You think this is about babies." My hand stopped on the kettle. She broke another bean. "It is not." I waited. Still not looking at me, she said, "It is about whether your body can ever belong to you once they have named your obedience holy." Then she tipped the beans into the pot, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked away. That was all. One sentence. A whole room full of women and one sentence spoken sideways over supper vegetables. I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand and felt something in me go very still. Not calmer, clearer. It was the first time anyone had said out loud what I had only been feeling like a stone in my apron pocket. Not that I was tired, not that I was ungrateful, not that marriage was hard, but that there was a framework underneath all of it. And the framework was the mistake, not me. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. These stories are not easy to tell. If this is resonating with you, subscribe, like this video, and if you want more stories like this, turn on the notification bell. I do not say that lightly. There is so much silence around these things, and every person who stays helps break a little of it. After Lydia, I began to notice how choreographed everything had been. The silence from my husband, the proverb from my mother, the coded correction from my sister-in-law, the spiritual language from the bishop's wife. It was a ladder of pressure, and every rung had been padded in gentleness so that if I objected, I would seem unreasonable. No one had shouted. No one had threatened me. No one had needed to. The system did not rely on spectacle. It relied on making the cost of selfhood feel unbearable. A month later, the bishop came. It was a Thursday evening, and there was apple butter cooling in crocks by the window. Jonas had changed into a clean shirt. I knew before anyone told me. That is another thing about Amish life. You learn to read weather before the storm breaks. The children had been sent to my sister's house. The kitchen was too tidy. The good cups were out. Bishop Eli was a gray-bearded man with tired eyes and the kind of gentleness that can make you doubt your own alarm. He sat at my table, accepted coffee, admired the woodpile, asked after the baby, and then folded his hands. "We do not want to lose you," he said. Lose me to what? I wanted to ask. To truth? To fatigue? To my own body? But of course I knew what he meant. He spoke of seasons of discouragement, of the danger of worldly thinking, of wives who let fear speak louder than faith. He said marriage asked for mutual generosity and that a woman's calling was often costly. Costly. Such a polished word. Then he said, "A home cannot stand if each person insists on being their own authority." I heard the sentence and realized, with a chill so complete it felt like stepping into river water, that my exhaustion had already been interpreted as rebellion. My limit had already been renamed pride. Hochmut is subtle, he added. There it was, the old warning. Not vanity, not arrogance in the way English people mean it, but the audacity to center what hurts. Jonas sat very still throughout all this, looking at his hands. I glanced at him only once and saw not cruelty, but fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of being judged a weak headship. Fear that if I refused the script, he would have to see it as a script. And then what would become of the whole house he had built his manhood inside? That is why I say again, he was not a monster. He was a man inside a machine. But machines break people all the same. After the bishop left, Jonas said only one thing. He said, "Why must you make simple things hard?" It was such a small sentence, and it found me everywhere I was wounded. Why must you make simple things hard? As if pregnancy were simple. As if surrender were simple. As if disappearing could be counted among the easy duties of an honest woman. I slept badly for weeks after that. I would lie awake beside his breathing and stare at the pale square of moonlight on the wall. Sometimes I imagined I could see the whole structure of my life the way you might see rafters if the ceiling were removed. Church, family, marriage, motherhood, obedience, silence, all joined together so tightly that to question one beam felt like bringing down the house. And maybe that was why no one dared ask. The house had been built around not asking. The moment I decided to leave was not dramatic. It did not happen after a fight because there was no fight. It did not happen after a sermon, though there were many. It did not happen after Lydia's sentence, though that sentence kept breathing in me. It happened in April, standing at the clothesline behind the house. The ground was soft with thaw. The children were chasing each other near the shed. I was pinning up Jonas's shirts, one after another. Dark blue, gray, dark blue again. The fabric heavy in my hands from rinse water not fully wrung out. My own dress clung damp against my legs. Beyond the line, I could see the road, and on it, an Englishwoman had stopped her car by the Miller place because she was asking directions. I remember this because she stood there with one hand on the roof of her car, laughing at something Mr. Miller said, and the sound of her laughter carried farther than it should have. Then she turned and opened the back door, and a little girl climbed out with 2 unmatched hair ribbons, and 1 yellow rain boot, and 1 red. The mother bent down and let the child choose which coat to wear. That was all. A stranger on a country road letting a little girl choose. It entered me like a splinter of light. I stood there with a wet shirt in my hands and thought, my daughter will grow up and they will call it holiness when she disappears too. I did not feel brave. I felt tired in a new direction. The way you know a season has changed is not that thunder announces it. It is that one day the air is different, and your body knows before your mind agrees. I went to the barn that evening after chores and counted the money I had hidden in a tobacco tin behind a loose board. Egg money. Sewing money. $2 from hemming a neighbor girl's wedding dress. Small bills folded twice. Not much. Enough to become real. I will not tell the whole leaving today, because it belongs to a different story. I will only say this. There was one bag. There was a phone shanty half a mile down the lane. There was a Mennonite woman in town who had once looked at me too carefully and left her number inside a pattern envelope, as if she expected one day I might understand what she was offering. There was a dawn in late May. There were children asleep. There was my whole body shaking so hard I had to sit on the bench by the door before I could stand up again. And then I left. What came after was not freedom all at once. People who have never been shunned sometimes imagine leaving as a straight line from darkness to light. It was not. It was a tearing. It was a birth without celebration. Letters came back unopened. Phone calls rang into silence. Once, months later, I saw my mother in town outside the feed store. She looked at me. I want to be honest about that. She did look at me. Her eyes filled. Then my father stepped out behind her, put his hand lightly at her elbow, and she turned her face away so quickly it was as if a curtain had been drawn. My sister crossed the street once rather than pass me on the sidewalk. The click of a receiver can be as loud in memory as any scream. For a long time, I told the story to myself the way my old world would have told it. I was too sensitive, too modern, too weak, too unwilling to bear the natural burdens of womanhood. I had broken my home because I wanted my life to feel easier than the lives of the women who came before me. Then I met my therapist. She was a small Englishwoman with reading glasses she was forever misplacing, and 3 plants in her office that looked healthier than I felt. The chair I sat in was soft in a way that made me suspicious. There were tissues on the table between us, which I considered presumptuous the first day. I did not intend to cry. She asked patient questions in a direct voice. Not dramatic questions, not accusing ones. Questions like, what happened when you said no? What did it cost you to disagree? When did you begin to feel your body was not fully yours? I answered badly at first. I spoke Amish even in English, by which I mean I moved around the center of things and described the weather instead. One afternoon, after I had spent nearly 40 minutes explaining why Jonas was not violent, and why the bishop had sounded kind, and why no one had ever exactly forced me, if by forced you meant what people on television seemed to mean, she set down her pen and said very gently, Hannah, consent that survives only because the cost of saying no has been made unbearable is not freely given. I stared at her. She went on, what you are describing is coercive control. That phrase changed me slowly. Coercive control. Later she gave me more words. Bodily autonomy. Emotional withdrawal as punishment. Community-enforced compliance. Trauma bond. She told me, the most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. Another day she said, a community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers. And once, when I was crying because I could not stop hearing my mother say, most women are, she leaned forward and said, your suffering was normalized, not sanctified. I had never heard anyone separate those things before. Suffering and holiness. Obedience and erasure, family and control. I want to be careful here. I do not hate the Amish. I need to say that plainly because people are often too eager for a villain simple enough to satisfy them. My husband was not a monster. My mother was not a monster. Bishop Eli was not sitting in his kitchen twirling a mustache and designing my pain with delight. These were people shaped by a system old enough to feel like truth. A system that gave us some beautiful things, too. Work ethic, mutual aid, practical tenderness, food when someone died, quilts stitched by many hands, faith spoken in labor rather than performance, sisters who knew how to make a home from almost nothing. I loved parts of that world. I still do. The system is the thing, not the people. But systems live through people, and that does not make the harm less real. When I think now of the women who came before me, I do not think first of weakness. I think of architecture. I think of load-bearing silence. I think of what it costs to survive inside a structure that names your disappearance obedience. I think of all the women who found private ways to remain alive inside themselves. The extra butter on a daughter's bread, the longer pause by the pump, the sentence spoken sideways over green beans, the number tucked into a sewing pattern. These were not revolutions large enough for history books. They were still ways of keeping one another human. So if you are listening to me from a place that has nothing to do with Amish buggies or prayer coverings or bishops in broad fall coats, but you know the feeling anyway, I want to say this part for you. If you grew up in a place where your body was treated like a duty before it was treated like a self, I see you. If you ever learned to measure the weather in a room by the silence of the person who loved you, I see you. If you have ever said yes because no would have cost you too much warmth, too much safety, too much belonging, I see you. If you were told that being good meant being smaller, quieter, easier to arrange, I see you. If someone taught you that your exhaustion was pride, your fear was rebellion, or your limit was selfishness, I see you. If you ever lay awake beside someone in the dark and counted the price of one honest sentence, I see you. If you ever thought maybe everyone else could bear what you could not, and so the failure must be yours, I see you. If your mother loved you and still could not help you because the wall was older than both of you, I see you. If you are the first woman in your family trying to name something everyone before you was trained to survive without naming, I see you. You were not weak. You were surviving inside a system that was built to make refusal feel like sin. And if you left, or are thinking about leaving, or only just now have language for why you have always felt cold in rooms other people called peaceful, I want you to know something my therapist told me years after I walked away. She said, "The framework was the mistake, not you." I have carried that sentence like bread in my pocket. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you. Or tell me your story, if you are ready. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to The Amish Stories. There is so much more I have not yet said. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your body is yours. It always was.